Well, I got a call one day from a gentleman named Tom Diskin, who took care of biz for Elvis. He worked for the Colonel, a very nice man.
There are people in this world whose entire profession is built on silence. Not the silence of cowardice or the silence of indifference, but a deep, trained, professional silence. The kind that gets instilled in you from the first day of mortuary school, reinforced through every year of practice, and ultimately becomes as natural as breathing. Embalmers don't talk about what they see. They don't discuss the condition of the bodies they receive. They don't share the details of what happens behind those closed preparation room doors. It's not just professional ethics. It's a code. An unspoken contract between the living and the dead that says, what happens in this room stays in this room. So when a man who has lived by that code for nearly 5 decades decides to break it, you stop. You listen. Because men like that don't speak without reason. And they don't speak without consequence. His name hasn't been released publicly, and for reasons that will become very clear as this story unfolds, that's deliberate. What we know about him is this. He was a licensed mortician working out of Memphis, Tennessee in the summer of 1977. He was 31 years old. He had been in the funeral business for just under a decade, trained under one of the most respected morticians in Shelby County, and his funeral home had a professional working relationship with some of the most prominent families in the city. He was good at his job. He was discreet. He was exactly the kind of man you would call when you needed something handled quietly. And on August 16th, 1977, someone called him. The date matters. If you know anything about Elvis Presley, you know that date the way you know your own birthday. It's the day the world stopped. The day radio stations interrupted their regular programming. The day grown men and women sat down in the middle of wherever they were and wept for someone most of them had never met. August 16th, 1977 is the day Elvis Presley was pronounced dead at Baptist Memorial Hospital in Memphis, Tennessee at 3:30 in the afternoon, officially at least. But the call that came into this embalmer's funeral home didn't come at 3:30 in the afternoon. It came earlier, significantly earlier. And that discrepancy, that gap between when he was called and when the death was officially announced, is the first thing he says he's never been able to reconcile. He didn't go to Graceland unprepared. That was the other thing that struck him, even at 31, even in the urgency of that afternoon. Before he arrived, he received instructions. Not a general briefing about the nature of the situation, not the kind of routine communication that passes between a funeral home and a client's family-specific instructions. He was told who would be present in the preparation area when he arrived. He was told which aspects of his standard documentation process would not be required, and he was told, clearly and without ambiguity, that certain observations he might make in the course of his professional work were to remain entirely outside of any written record. He was told all of this before he had seen anything, before he had walked through the doors of Graceland, before he had any professional context for why such instructions would even be necessary. Think about what that means. The instructions preceded the observation, which means whoever gave those instructions already knew what he was going to see. When he arrived at Graceland, the atmosphere was unlike anything he had encountered in his professional life, before or since. There were people everywhere in the hallways and the surrounding rooms, moving through the property with the kind of controlled urgency that looks calm on the surface but radiates panic underneath. He was escorted directly to the area where he would work, and as he described it decades later, the thing that immediately struck him was not the grief, not the chaos, not even the magnitude of who was lying in front of him. What struck him was the people in the room who had absolutely no professional reason to be there. In any normal preparation scenario, the number of people present is minimal. There are legal and ethical reasons for this. What this embalmer found when he arrived was a room containing individuals he did not recognize. individuals who were not introduced to him, individuals who watched him work in silence and did not leave. He asked at one point who they were. He was told they were there to assist. He did not ask again. He worked that night under observation. Every movement he made was watched. Every notation he considered making was visible to people whose names he still remembers, whose faces he can still describe, and who he has since identified as members of Elvis's inner circle men who had no mortuary training, no medical background, and no professional standing to be present during the preparation of a body. And yet there they were, watching, waiting, making certain that what happened in that room stayed in that room. He kept this secret for 47 years. Not because he didn't understand its weight, he understood it completely. From the moment he walked out of Graceland that night and felt the instructions he'd been given pressing down on him like something physical. He kept it because he was a 31-year-old man with a wife, 2 children, and a business that depended on relationships he couldn't afford to destroy. He kept it because the people who gave him those instructions made certain he understood exactly what silence was worth and exactly what speaking would cost. But he is 79 years old now. And the calculus of silence changes when you're facing the end of your own life. When you realize that the secret you've been carrying isn't protecting anyone who deserves protection anymore. When you decide that the king deserved better than what happened in that room, and that the people who loved him deserve to finally know the truth. There is a particular kind of knowledge that only comes from years of working with the dead. It's not something you can learn from a textbook, or absorb from a lecture, or develop through observation alone. It comes from thousands of hours of quiet, careful, intimate work, from learning to read a body the way a doctor reads a chart, the way a detective reads a crime scene. After enough years in this profession, you don't just see what's in front of you. You understand what it's telling you. And what it's telling you doesn't always match what the paperwork says. More than 90% of the people watching this video right now still aren't subscribed, and that means most people are missing out on exclusive, untold stories about Elvis Presley you won't find anywhere else. If you don't want to miss the next revelation, now's the time. Subscribe, hit the bell, and share this video with one friend. Now let's continue. This embalmer had prepared over 3,000 bodies by the time he reached his late career. He had worked on victims of car accidents, of house fires, of prolonged illness, of sudden cardiac events. He knew, with the kind of certainty that only experience builds, what each of those deaths looked like on the body afterward. He knew the specific way the musculature responds to different causes of death. He knew what the skin tells you, what the coloring tells you, what the overall physical presentation of a body communicates to someone trained to listen to it. He had seen cardiac deaths, hundreds of them. He knew exactly what they looked like. What he saw on the preparation table at Graceland that August night did not look like a cardiac death. He has been careful, in the years since he first began speaking about this, not to overstate what he observed. He is not a toxicologist. He is not a physician. He has never claimed to know with medical certainty what caused Elvis Presley to die. What he has claimed consistently, specifically, and without wavering is that the physical presentation of Elvis's body was inconsistent with what he had seen in his professional experience with cardiac-related deaths, and that several of his observations pointed toward something that should have triggered a far more rigorous investigation than the one that was actually conducted. The first thing that struck him was the body's overall physical state specifically, the degree of what professionals call lividity. Lividity is the settling of blood after death, and it leaves visible, mappable marks on the body that allow an experienced mortician to make fairly precise estimates about how long someone has been dead and in what position. What he observed suggested that Elvis had been in his discovered position for considerably longer than the official timeline indicated. The gap between what the body was showing him And what the official record claimed about the discovery time wasn't subtle. It wasn't a matter of minutes. It was significant enough that he noted it immediately, and significant enough that he understood, instantly, why the men standing in that room were watching him so carefully. He said nothing. He continued working. The second observation was harder to rationalize away. Elvis Presley's official cause of death was listed as cardiac arrhythmia, essentially, an irregular heartbeat that became fatal. This was the conclusion offered to the public, reinforced through press statements, and accepted without serious challenge in the immediate aftermath. But the embalmer's professional experience with cardiac deaths carried a specific set of physical expectations, and Elvis's body did not meet them in several critical ways. The physical signs he observed were more consistent, in his professional assessment, with what he had seen in cases involving catastrophic pharmaceutical accumulation cases where the body had been overwhelmed not by a single cardiac event, but by a sustained physiological collapse driven by toxic levels of multiple substances interacting simultaneously. Again, he is not a toxicologist. He is not making a clinical diagnosis across nearly 5 decades of distance. But he has spent 40 years preparing bodies, and he knows the difference between what he was seeing and what the official paperwork was telling him he should be seeing. And the difference was not small. What made this observation particularly significant was its relationship to something he'd already been told before he arrived. He had been instructed not to document certain physical observations. That instruction was given before anyone could have known what he would find, which meant it wasn't a reactive measure. It was anticipatory. Whoever gave that instruction already knew what the body would show and had already decided that it would not enter the official record. The third thing he observed, and this is the detail he has described as the one that never left him, the one that still surfaces in the early hours of the morning when sleep doesn't come easily, was a specific physical marking on the body that he had not been told to exclude from documentation, apparently because whoever gave the instructions hadn't anticipated that he would notice it. He noticed it. He said nothing. He completed his work. And when he left Graceland that night, he carried that observation with him like a stone in his chest, because he understood immediately what it implied about the events that had preceded Elvis's death and about who else had been present in that house during the hours that were never fully accounted for. He sat in his car outside the Graceland gates for a long time before he drove away. He has described that moment as the last time in his life that he seriously considered going back inside and telling someone what he'd seen. He thought about his wife. He thought about his children. He thought about the men who had watched him work in silence. And then he started the car and drove home and said nothing to anyone, not that night, not for nearly 5 decades. He said later, when he finally began to speak, that the hardest part wasn't carrying the secret. The hardest part was knowing that 3,000 other families had trusted him with their most sacred grief, and that for one family, for the millions of people who loved Elvis Presley, he had failed that trust completely. "I've prepared over 3,000 bodies in my career," he said. "I know what a man who died of a heart attack looks like. What I saw that night in Graceland, that wasn't it. Understanding what he saw is only half of this story. The other half, the half that reveals just how deliberately and systematically the truth was buried, is understanding what happened in the 72 hours after he left Graceland. Because the night of August 16th, 1977, wasn't just the night Elvis Presley died. It was the night a machine quietly switched on. A machine designed not to grieve, not to memorialize, not to investigate, but to contain. And this embalmer was one of the first people that machine reached out to touch. He went home that night and said nothing to his wife. Not because he didn't trust her, but because he understood instinctively that what he was carrying was the kind of information that becomes dangerous the moment it leaves a single person's possession. He had seen enough of how Memphis worked the interconnected relationships between its powerful families its legal infrastructure, its social hierarchies to know that a 31-year-old mortician who started talking about what he'd observed inside Graceland would not be talking for very long. So, he stayed quiet. He went to work the next morning, he read the newspapers like everyone else, and he watched the official narrative take shape in real time, knowing with absolute professional certainty that significant pieces of it were wrong. The visit came on the third day. He hadn't been expecting it, though in retrospect he says he probably should have. A man arrived at his funeral home, not Elvis's personal attorney, not a Graceland family member, but a representative, a fixer, in the language that would come to define that era's celebrity machinery. The man was polite. He was well-dressed. He spoke in the measured, unhurried tone of someone who has had this kind of conversation before and expects it to go a particular way. He thanked the embalmer for his professionalism on the night in question. He expressed the family's gratitude for his discretion, and then, without any significant change in tone or posture, he placed a document on the desk between them. It was a non-disclosure agreement. Professionally typed, legally reviewed, specific in its language about what could and could not be discussed regarding his work at Graceland on the night of August 16th. This was 1977. Non-disclosure agreements existed in the business world, in entertainment contracts, in certain legal settlements, but they were not standard instruments in the funeral industry. They were not documents that morticians routinely signed. The fact that this agreement was sitting on his desk, fully prepared, within 72 hours of Elvis's death, told him something that no amount of polite conversation could obscure. This document had been drafted before anyone knew what he might say, which meant it had been drafted before he'd even finished his work. Someone had anticipated the need to silence him before he had given anyone a reason to. He looked at the agreement. He looked at the man sitting across from him. And then the man said something that the embalmer has repeated, word for word, every time he's described this moment. He said it calmly, almost gently, as if he were sharing a piece of friendly professional advice. He noted that Graceland's ongoing business represented a meaningful portion of the funeral home's annual revenue. He noted that the family valued their relationship with the establishment deeply. He noted that they hoped that relationship would continue for many years to come. And then he slid a pen across the desk and waited. The threat was never stated directly. It didn't need to be. The architecture of it was so clear, so precisely constructed, that stating it outright would have been almost redundant. Sign this document and your business is protected. Don't sign it and find out what happens to a small Memphis funeral home that loses its most prominent client and gains a reputation for indiscretion among every other prominent family in the city. He was 31 years old. He had a mortgage. He had 2 children under the age of 5. He had spent nearly a decade building something from nothing. He picked up the pen and he signed. What followed was 46 years of practiced silence. Not comfortable silence there is nothing comfortable about carrying the weight of what he knew. But functional silence, the kind you build a life around, carefully constructing routines and relationships that never get close enough to the thing you're protecting to accidentally disturb it. He raised his children. He expanded his business. He became, by all external measures, a respected and successful member of his community. And every August 16th, when the anniversary memorials played on television and the official story was retold with the same carefully maintained details, he sat with what he knew and said nothing. There were moments when the silence almost broke. In 1994, a journalist investigating Elvis's prescription drug history made contact with him through a mutual acquaintance. They met once, briefly. The journalist asked careful questions. The embalmer gave careful non-answers and ended the meeting early. That night, he received a phone call not from the journalist, but from a Memphis attorney he recognized as someone connected to the Presley estate's legal operations. The attorney didn't ask what had been discussed. He simply called to check in, he said, to see how things were going. The message was received with perfect clarity. In 2008, a documentary filmmaker approached him directly, having tracked him down through funeral industry records. He turned the filmmaker away at his front door without a word beyond a firm and final no. The filmmaker later reported receiving a legal notice suggesting that any documentary referencing the Embalmer's involvement with Elvis Presley's preparation would be subject to immediate litigation. The machine was still running. Decades later, it was still running. What changed everything was a diagnosis in the spring of 2023. The specific nature of his illness is his own private information, and he's chosen not to share it publicly. What he has shared is what it felt like to sit across from a doctor and understand, for the first time with genuine physical immediacy, that the years he had remaining were no longer abstract, that the time for indefinite silence had a shape to it now, a boundary, and that on the other side of that boundary, whatever he hadn't said would simply cease to exist, buried with him, permanently, exactly as the Presley machine had always intended. He made a decision, not immediately and not without significant internal conflict. But he made it, and the first person he told wasn't a journalist. It wasn't a filmmaker. It wasn't a lawyer or a genealogist or a documentary producer. The first person he told was someone still working inside Graceland's current operation, someone employed by the estate that has spent nearly 5 decades protecting the very secret he was now unraveling. He told them what he'd seen. He told them what he'd been instructed to conceal. He told them about the document he'd signed and the man who'd brought it and the phone call that came in 1994. And the response he received from that person, from someone embedded inside the institution that built this cover-up, was not disbelief. It was not shock. It was not the reaction of someone hearing something impossible for the first time. It was the reaction of someone who had already suspected. Someone who had worked inside that house long enough to understand that the official story had always had rooms in it that no one was allowed to enter. Someone who looked at him and said, quietly, that he wasn't the only one who knew things they'd never been allowed to say out loud. That response told him everything. The cover-up hadn't just reached outside Graceland's walls. It had lived inside them all along. Here is what we know with certainty. Elvis Presley died on August 16, 1977, inside Graceland, and the official explanation for his death was cardiac arrhythmia. Here is what we also know. The medical examiner who conducted his autopsy was a personal friend of the Presley family. The full autopsy findings were sealed, not partially restricted, not selectively withheld, but completely sealed for 50 years. And when those records were partially released in 2022, independent medical analysts who reviewed them identified something that the official narrative had never adequately explained. There were internal inconsistencies in the report itself, observations that didn't align with each other, conclusions that didn't follow naturally from the documented findings, gaps where there should have been specificity, and specificity where the record should have been cleaner. The Embalmer's account doesn't just add another voice to the conversation about Elvis's death. It provides a potential explanation for why those inconsistencies exist in the first place. If certain physical observations were excluded from the official record, before they were ever documented, if the preparation of Elvis's body was conducted under conditions specifically designed to ensure that particular details never entered any professional paperwork, then the autopsy. Reports' inconsistencies stop being mysterious. They become logical. They become the expected result of a record that was shaped by omission rather than built on complete observation. This is the part of the story that moves beyond one man's testimony and into the architecture of an institutional cover-up. Elvis's personal physician, Dr. George Nicopolis, known to everyone in Memphis as Dr. Nick was investigated by the Tennessee Board of Medical Examiners multiple times in the years following Elvis's death. The findings of those investigations were staggering. In the final 20 months of Elvis's life, Dr. Nicopolis had prescribed him more than 10,000 doses of sedatives, amphetamines, and narcotics. 10,000 doses in 20 months. That number represents a level of pharmaceutical involvement so extreme that it goes far beyond negligence into territory that carries its own set of legal and moral implications. Dr. Nicopolis was eventually tried on criminal charges of overprescribing. He was acquitted. His medical license wasn't revoked until 1995, 18 years after Elvis died. But the Embalmer's account suggests that the investigation into Dr. Nicopolis, as damaging as it was, may have been carefully bounded. Contained, because the question that his testimony raises isn't just about how many pills Elvis was prescribed, it's about who else knew. Who else was involved in managing Elvis's pharmaceutical consumption? Who else had liability exposure if the true physiological reality of Elvis's death, the full picture, unedited, had ever been officially documented? The prescription network that surrounded Elvis in his final years wasn't a secret to the people inside Graceland. It was an open reality that multiple members of his inner circle navigated daily. And if the physical evidence of what that network had done to his body had been fully documented, the legal and reputational consequences would have extended far beyond one doctor. That is what was actually being protected in that preparation room on August 16, 1977. Not just Elvis's image, not just the family's grief. The liability of an entire ecosystem of people who had watched a man consume himself and done nothing or worse actively facilitated it. When the Embalmer's account began circulating in late 2023, the Presley estate's response arrived quickly and followed a pattern that will feel familiar to anyone who has followed this story closely. They questioned his credentials. They suggested his memory at 79 was unreliable. They described him as a confused elderly man seeking attention in his final years, a characterization so transparently designed to discredit rather than address that it functioned as its own kind of confirmation. Because what they did not do is equally important. They did not produce documentation contradicting his specific claims about the preparation room. They did not invite independent review of the sealed autopsy materials still in their possession. They did not say with any specificity, here is what actually happened that night, and here is the evidence that proves it. They attacked the man and protected the room, just as they always have. This pattern, attack the witness, seal the evidence, obstruct the verification, is not a defensive strategy that innocent institutions deploy. It is the strategy of an institution that knows the room it's protecting contains something it cannot afford to have examined. And the consistency of that strategy across nearly 5 decades, across multiple witnesses, across journalists and filmmakers and genealogists and now a dying embalmer with nothing left to lose, is itself the most damning evidence of all. For the millions of people who loved Elvis Presley, who grew up with his music, who stood in line at Graceland, who felt his voice as something personal and sacred, this story carries a particular weight. Because it isn't just about how he died. It's about what the people around him chose to protect instead of choosing to protect him. It's about a man who was, by all accounts, in catastrophic physical decline in his final years, surrounded by people who had the power to intervene and instead had the incentive to look away. The cover-up didn't begin the night he died. It began long before that, in the daily decisions of people who chose their own interests over his life. The embalmer spent 47 years carrying what he saw in that room. He says the weight of it never got lighter. Not once. Not across a single one of those 47 years did it become easier to hold. And now that he's finally spoken, now that the details he's given are sitting in the public record, where anyone with the right professional background can begin to verify them, there are people inside Graceland who are very, very afraid. not because his story is false, but because every specific detail he's provided can be checked. Every claim he's made exists within a framework of medical records, legal documents, and professional timelines that are still accessible to people who know where to look. And they know it. They've always known it. The only thing they've ever actually controlled is how long the truth takes to reach the surface. It just reached it. If what you just heard about Elvis's final night has shaken you good, the truth should shake us. Subscribe now so you never miss what comes next. Hit the bell, drop a comment telling us what shocked you most, and share this with someone who thinks they already know the full story of Elvis Presley. They don't.